Northern France, spring of 1940. A German tank commander was peering out of his tiny vision slit, failing really, not to laugh. In front of his Panzer II stood a lone British soldier wrestling with a long, awkward-looking contraption that seemed better suited for clearing gutters than fighting a war. The thing was nearly the man's height, balanced on spindly legs, and looked completely out of place on a battlefield filled with steel giants. The Brit squeezed the trigger. The weapon kicked like a mule, slammed the poor man onto his back, and the shot bounced off the Panzer's armor with all the menace of a thrown pebble. Within minutes, German radio chatter was full of jokes. They nicknamed the British weapon the elephant gun, as if the British had dragged a big game rifle out of some colonial hunting lodge and called it a day. To them, it was comedy, gold, evidence that the so-called industrial powerhouse of the British Empire had resorted to firing drainpipes at tanks. The laughter didn't last. Once British troops learned where to aim and how to use that odd-looking rifle properly, it became a very different story. A skilled shot could punch a hole straight through the thin side armor of early war German tanks from hundreds of yards away. That hardened steel bullet didn't simply enter. It tore into the crew compartment glowing white-hot, ricocheting around like a furious hornet. Inside, no one was laughing. The ridiculous drainpipe was officially the boys' anti-tank rifle, and for many British infantry units in the desperate early months of the war, it was the only thing standing between them and an oncoming tank. To understand why Britain issued such a curious weapon, you have to rewind to the 1930s, a time when militaries across Europe were staring into a very uncertain future. Tanks had made their debut in the First World War, but that conflict ended before anyone truly figured out how to use them. By the mid-30s, the world was getting a preview of what was coming. The Spanish Civil War was tearing a country apart and doubling as a live-fire experiment. Soviet factories were pouring out tanks by the thousands. Germany, Treaty of Versailles or not, was clearly preparing for mechanized warfare. British infantry doctrine had always relied on teamwork. Artillery, machine gun crews, riflemen, all supporting one another. But what happened if enemy tanks punched through the line and your guns were miles behind you? What could an ordinary foot soldier do when a metal monster rolled straight toward him? A standard rifle? Pointless grenades? Only if you wanted to risk your life getting close enough to throw one. Anti-tank guns? Powerful but heavy, slow to move, and never where you needed them fast enough. A portable weapon, something one soldier could carry, set up, and fire, wasn't just useful. It was essential. Britain wasn't alone in this scramble. Germany had its Panzerbüchse 38. Poland created the WZ-35. Finland would soon issue the L-39 elephant gun of their own. Everyone was trying to solve the same problem: how to give the infantryman a fighting chance against the rising tide of armor. Across Europe, the solution looked almost identical. Take a rifle, make it much bigger, and load it with a cartridge powerful enough to punch through thin tank armor at combat distances. These anti-tank rifles weren't built to obliterate a tank like an artillery shell would. Their goal was more pragmatic: to wreck the parts that mattered: vision slits, periscopes, fuel tanks, radiators, or the crew's living space. In short, they aimed to turn a rolling metal fortress into a wounded machine, giving infantry a real chance to survive and counterattack. Britain's answer to that problem became one of the most widely distributed anti-tank rifles of the war. It showed up everywhere British and Commonwealth soldiers fought, from the hedgerows of France to the deserts and jungles beyond. And yes, at first German tank crews loved to sneer. But the laughter died the first time around from one of those rifles ripped through a side plate and killed or maimed men inside. Why did Britain rush this weapon into service? Because the warnings were already arriving in the 1930s. Observers in Spain sent back grim dispatches. Tanks, light and thinly armored by later standards, like the Soviet T-26 and Germany's Panzer I, were proving devastating against infantry caught unprepared. Even modestly armed armor could punch holes in defensive lines, scatter dug-in troops, and turn a stable front into chaos. Meanwhile, Britain's own armored forces were a mess. Post-Great War cuts and decades of neglect left the army with aging tanks and no consensus on how to use them. Some commanders imagined tanks moving slowly beside infantry. Others wanted fast, separate armored formations. That debate brewed as other nations built mechanized forces with clear, aggressive plans. Worse still, the British infantry had almost nothing to meet a tank at close range. The trusty .303 rifle round that had dominated colonial wars and trench fighting was useless against armor. You could fire a whole magazine at a steel flank, and the crew inside wouldn't flinch. Grenades might damage tracks or injure exposed crew if you could get terrifyingly close. But machine guns and hull guns made those approaches suicidal. Artillery could stop tanks, but only when it was in the right place at the right time. An unreliable luxury in a fast-moving battle. What the foot soldier needed was simple and brutal, a portable, hard-hitting tool he could carry into the fight and use when heavier weapons weren't available. Hence the big, ugly rifles, awkward to haul, brutal to fire, but sometimes the only thing separating a platoon from being overrun. The British Army did have a proper anti-tank gun on the way, the 2-pounder, but in the late 1930s it was still a design on paper more than a weapon in the field. Even once it reached the troops, it had limits. It needed a crew, it needed a towing vehicle, and it needed time to dig in. When everything was set up correctly, it was a deadly defensive weapon. But it couldn't cover every road, every hedgerow, or every platoon scattered across a battlefield. That was the real problem. What happened to the lonely infantry company stationed miles from support? What about scouting units, advance guards, supply columns, groups that would never be assigned a heavy gun but could still run headfirst into enemy armor? Spain had already shown the world what that situation looked like. Infantry with no way to fight back against tanks didn't just suffer casualties. They broke. Survivors spoke less about the explosions and more about the dread. Watching a tank crawl toward you while your bullets did nothing created a kind of paralysis. Morale collapsed long before the tanks even reached the trenches. British planners understood that the next war wouldn't involve a handful of light tanks creeping around a village. Germany was building armored forces on an industrial scale. By 1937, it was obvious where things were heading. Hitler was rearming in the open. Austria was all but swallowed. Czechoslovakia was in danger. Every sign pointed to a massive conflict, and British infantry were about to face modern armored divisions with little more than rifles and grit. The War Office finally put out a clear request: build a portable anti-tank weapon a single soldier could carry. It had to hit hard, reach out several hundred yards, and be simple enough to mass-produce quickly. Speed was everything. At Enfield's Royal Small Arms Factory, an engineer named Captain Henry Boys stepped forward with an idea that seemed either visionary or absolutely insane. Boys wasn't famous, but people who worked with him knew his mind ran deep into the mechanics of firearms, recoil dynamics, barrel pressures, velocity curves. He lived and breathed this stuff. What the War Office wanted was almost impossible: a rifle that a man could shoulder, yet powerful enough to punch through tank armor. Physics pushed back hard. To pierce steel, you needed staggering force. Force meant energy. Energy meant speed or weight. And either one created recoil that could knock a grown man flat. Boys started with the heart of the weapon, the cartridge. He designed a new 55-inch round with a hardened steel core hidden inside a copper jacket. It weighed just under 2 ounces, enormous for a rifle bullet. When fired, it screamed out of the barrel at about 3,250 feet per second, nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The energy it produced was astonishing, around 13,000 foot-pounds. For comparison, a standard Lee Enfield rifle, the British infantryman's everyday weapon, delivered roughly 2,500. In other words, Boys had created a rifle that behaved like a small artillery piece, and now the challenge was building a gun strong enough to survive firing it without tearing itself apart. Captain Boy's rifle looked and felt like a compromise hammered out against the laws of physics. To get the kind of muzzle energy needed to pierce tank armor, the barrel had to be long, absurdly long for a shoulder weapon. The finished gun carried a 3-foot 7-inch barrel and stretched over 5 feet from muzzle to butt. In other words, taller than many of the men who would lug it across fields and hedgerows. Weight was the penalty. With bipod and 5-round magazine attached, the whole package weighed roughly 36 pounds. Loaded, it wasn't a rifle so much as a small person you carried into battle. That heaviness dictated how it would be used. Not as a light, everywhere weapon, but as something a team had to wrestle into place, fire, and move again. Boys knew the recoil would be savage, so he built cleverness into the design. The barrel was free to slide back slightly on firing, so the weapon ate some of the shock before it hit the shooter. A huge muzzle brake spit gases sideways to counter the backward kick. The stock ended in a thick rubber pad to soften the blow. All of it worked, up to a point. Even with those measures, the rifle hit like a thrown boulder. First-timers learned fast. The trigger took a hefty pull, and when that round went, the world for a heartbeat became a thunderclap. The blast roared, the shoulder slammed, and anyone who hadn't been taught the drill could end up on his back. After a session at the range, even seasoned crews showed the signs. Sore shoulders, ringing ears, the bruises that reminded you the weapon had done its job. Production began in 1937 under the official name Rifle, Anti-Tank 155 in, those soldiers and history would simply call it the Boys. There's a small mystery in the paperwork about whether the gun was officially named for its creator or if another name was intended. But the fact that Captain Boys died the same year his rifle was accepted left no doubt about whose name stuck to the metal. By 1938, the Army began issuing the rifle to frontline units. Giving time for training before war made theory deadly serious. The instruction couldn't be simpler. Aim where it matters and fight like a fox. Hitting the thick frontal plate was a waste. Shots there would glance off. The rifle's power mattered only when a gunner could find thinner side plates, vision blocks, engine covers, fuel tanks, or the vulnerable bits around a turret ring. A well-placed hit could blind a tank, pierce a radiator, or turn an internal compartment into a lethal oven. Tactics followed the tool. The Boys' rifle wanted ambushes, not duels. A small team would hide, wait for a column to present its flank, fire a handful of rapid surgical shots into weak points, and then melt away before return fire found them. It was terrifyingly effective when done right, and nerve-shredding when you had to let a tank draw within a few hundred yards before you could safely shoot. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain had roughly 2,200 of the rifles in service, enough for most battalions to field a platoon of boys' teams, but not enough to cure the larger strategic problem. The weapon was awkward, punishing, and far from perfect. Yet for many infantrymen in the dark early years, it was the nearest thing to a lifeline against armor. A heavy, painful, and sometimes life-saving answer to an enemy that otherwise laughed at small arms fire. The Boys' rifle left its mark on men in ways a normal service rifle never did. The most talked about injury was the broken collarbone. When a gunner failed to lock the stock tightly into the shoulder or let the butt sit wrong, the weapon didn't just kick, it snapped backwards. Instead of the impact spreading across the shoulder, the force concentrated on the clavicle. One sharp crack and you were out of action. Bruises were the rule rather than the exception. Even hardened crews finished live fire drills with shoulders that went black and purple for weeks. Recoil wasn't the only enemy. Some shooters developed a nervous flinch, a reflex born of repeated punishment. Anticipating the blow, they jerked the trigger instead of squeezing it smoothly, ruining their aim. With a rifle that demanded perfect shot placement, that flinch could be fatal. Mechanically, the Boys was old school and brutal. Its bolt action was built like a safe, heavy, dependable, and stubborn. After each shot, the gunner had to heave the bolt up, pull it hard to the rear to extract the spent case, and ram it forward to feed the next round. The 5-round magazine sat on top of the action, gravity and a spring pushing cartridges down into the chamber. In calm conditions, a practiced crew might manage around 10 aimed shots a minute. In the chaos of combat, shells bursting, tanks closing, adrenaline spiking, that rhythm usually slowed. Ammunition came in tailored flavors. The The standard armor-piercing round used a hardened steel core wrapped in a copper jacket, the classic tank buster. At a direct, right-angle hit, it could slice through roughly 15 mm of homogeneous steel at 300 yards. At 100 yards, that figure climbed to about 21 mm. The cartridge kept enough velocity to be dangerous out to roughly 500 yards, but effective accuracy for anti-tank work fell off after about 300. Later, a tungsten-cored W Mark I round pushed penetration higher, in the right conditions, into the mid-20 mm range. Those numbers tell a blunt truth. Penetration was a matter of physics, impact velocity, projectile hardness, armor thickness, and the simple geometry of the strike, all decided whether a bullet would bite or bounce. A round hitting square on at 90 degrees did the most damage. Strike at an oblique angle, and the effective armor thickness increased, making penetration far less likely. Under fire, gunners had to judge angles and ranges with their nerves frayed and earth flying from nearby explosions. The rifle's usefulness didn't end at tanks. Because each shot carried colossal kinetic energy, the boys was also a handy tool against light fortifications, trucks, armored cars, and anything on the ground that could be pierced. Bricks, sandbags, thin plates, all were vulnerable. Some units even tried using it at extreme ranges against personnel, but costly specialized ammunition and limited supply made that a controversial waste. Teamwork made the weapon work. 2 men were the minimum: a gunner to aim and fire, and a loader assistant to feed rounds, spot hits, carry spare ammo, and heave the gun when it had to move. The bipod gave steady aim but made sudden relocation awkward. To be effective, you needed solid ground and time to set up. In short, the boys demanded respect: heavy, unforgiving, and technically demanding, but in many hands, a decisive tool against the armored threat. The boys' rifle demanded careful setup. Fire it from soft ground and the bipod legs dug in unevenly, pitching the muzzle off target. Men who lived long enough to learn its habits sought out firmer footing: a patch of road, a packed trench floor, a low wall. Anything that kept the rifle steady and helped soak up the blast that erupted with every shot. Its first real trial came during the desperate spring of 1940. The British Expeditionary Force had gone into France with boys' rifles spread through its infantry battalions and reconnaissance units. When Germany launched its Case Yellow offensive on May 10th, armored columns surged out of the Ardennes with a speed and coordination that stunned the Allies. The situations British planners had imagined during quiet staff meetings suddenly unfolded for real. Except now the tanks weren't arriving in 2s and 3s. They came in waves, accompanied by infantry and aircraft, moving like a single machine. On May 21st, near the Belgian town of Arras, detachments of the Durham Light Infantry encountered a German reconnaissance force. A lance corporal named Thomas, crouched behind a stone wall with a boy's rifle balanced on its bipod, took aim at a Panzer II roughly 200 yards away. His first shot punched into the turret's side and wounded the loader. Realizing his tank was exposed, the commander threw the vehicle into reverse while others scrambled for cover. Thomas fired twice more, damaging another tank's engine deck before he was forced to withdraw under return fire. It wasn't a dramatic victory, but it showed the weapon could do exactly what it had been built to do. Stories like this spread quickly. The Panzer Y, with barely 13 millimeters of armor at its thickest point, was completely outmatched by the boys at almost any practical angle. Even the slightly stronger Panzer II, with around 14.5 millimeters on the front and 13 on the sides, could be pierced reliably at a few hundred yards. German after-action reports, once mocking, shifted in tone. Tank commanders were warned not to expose their flanks, and were told to drench suspected anti-tank rifle positions with immediate, overwhelming fire. In North Africa, the lessons grew even clearer. When Italian forces moved into Egypt in 1940, Commonwealth troops discovered that many of the tanks they faced were even more fragile. The tiny Fiat L335 tankette, barely protected against rifle-caliber rounds, was completely helpless against the boys. At Sidi Barrani, Australian infantry used their rifles to tear through the side plates of M1340 medium tanks at distances that stunned Italian crews. In one engagement, a single boys' team stopped 3 tanks in quick succession by firing into the rear engine decks, leaving them smoking and abandoned. The sand and rock of the desert also suited the weapon. Well-hidden teams could wait, let the enemy wander into a kill zone, and deliver a handful of precise shots before slipping away. During the long siege of Tobruk in 1941, Australian defenders used boys' rifles to keep German reconnaissance vehicles at arm's length, denying them safe approaches and constantly reminding them that even light armor wasn't light enough. The boys' rifle didn't just leave dents in steel. It left marks on the minds of the men inside those tanks. German crews quickly learned that any British position might be hiding a weapon capable of punching straight through their armor. That uncertainty slowed their advances. Patrols moved more carefully. Recon units hesitated before pushing forward. Sometimes an attack stalled simply because no one wanted to be the first tank into a field where a boys' team might be waiting. But the early successes also exposed hard truths. At Calais in May 1940, British troops discovered that owning an anti-tank rifle wasn't enough. You had to know exactly how to use it. Shots fired in a rush or at bad angles did nothing but give away the shooter's position. And once the nearby German infantry started closing in, a single lucky hit on a tank didn't mean much. You could stop a vehicle, but you couldn't stop the men jumping out of trucks and running toward your trench. The boys' rifle only really shined when it was part of a larger defensive web. Overlapping fields of fire, machine guns ready to suppress infantry, and other anti-tank assets backing it up. Alone, a boys' team rarely lasted long after the enemy spotted them. The Germans adapted quickly. Through 1940 and 1941, engineers studied captured rifles and combat reports, and saw the obvious problem. Early German tanks simply weren't armored enough. The answer was straightforward. Add more steel. The Panzer III Aus-H rolled off the lines with 30 millimeters of frontal armor, plus an extra 30 millimeter plate bolted on top. Panzer Irs received similar upgrades. Almost overnight, the rifle that had frightened Panzer I and II crews was useless against these reinforced fronts. A boys' round that could slip through 15 millimeters of armor at a decent distance now glanced off without leaving more than a scorch mark. Even special tungsten ammunition couldn't close the widening gap. German tankers learned exactly where they were safe and where they weren't. Head-on, they were nearly untouchable. Only close-range side shots still posed a real threat. Matters grew worse as heavier tanks appeared in the desert. By 1941, the Panzer IVs arriving in North Africa carried 50 millimeters of armor on their noses. Trying to stop one from the front with a boys' rifle was like firing at a brick wall. Hits on the flanks sometimes worked, but only if the angle was perfect and the range was uncomfortably short. What had once been a lifeline for the infantry was turning into a burden. Heavy to lug around, slow to handle, and increasingly powerless. The fighting in Greece and Crete made this painfully clear. Commonwealth troops still relying on the boys found themselves facing armor that simply ignored them. At Mount Olympus in April, New Zealand units fired round after round at approaching panzers and watched every shot bounce away as if they were hitting a shield. The tanks rolled on, guns blazing, while the rifle teams scrambled to find a better angle that never came. Many boys' rifle teams never got the chance to adjust. The same grim pattern unfolded across Crete in May. British and Commonwealth defenders took aim at German armor, only to discover their shots simply didn't matter. The rifles that once promised a fighting chance were now little more than dead weight as the airborne invasion pushed forward. And then came 1941, the year that truly ended whatever hope the anti-tank rifle had left. When Germany slammed into the Soviet Union in June, their troops met the T-34, a tank in an entirely different league. Its armor wasn't just thick, it was angled, layered, and clever. 45 millimeters of sloped steel on the hull, more than 50 around the turret. It shrugged off rifle fire completely. British boys' teams couldn't touch it. German soldiers using their own Panzerbüchse 38 rifles were just as helpless. In barely 3 years, the era of the anti-tank rifle had burned bright and burned out. The tanks had simply outgrown it. Back in North Africa, British forces had to rethink everything. They stopped even trying to shoot head-on. Instead, boys' teams learned to lurk in wadis, dunes, and rocky cover, waiting for a tank to expose its side. Many crews gave up hunting armor altogether and shifted to side jobs, wrecking trucks, knocking out machine gun nests, and chewing through fortifications. During Operation Crusader in late 1941, countless boys' rifles ended up guarding supply points and headquarters areas rather than facing German armor that they could no longer threaten. This slide into obsolescence created a painful dilemma. Infantry companies still carried the boys because there was nothing else available in meaningful numbers. No rockets, no lightweight cannons. Yet hauling them across the desert made little sense when ammunition was scarce, and the rifle couldn't penetrate the tanks that mattered. But leaving them behind meant going into battle with absolutely no anti-tank tool at the small unit level. Some units resorted to desperate hybrids: a boy's rifle for distraction, sticky bombs or Molotovs for the actual kill. These improvised schemes seldom worked and often cost lives. By early 1942, the verdict was unavoidable. Britain needed a new answer. Fast, but obsolete didn't mean pointless. Soldiers in the field don't have the luxury of discarding anything that still fires. And the boy's rifle, oversized and outdated as it was, could still unleash a 2-ounce projectile at nearly 3,000 feet per second. In the right situation, that raw power became a tool nobody at the Royal Small Arms Factory had ever imagined. Singapore, February 1942, is where this became brutally clear. Urban combat transformed the battlefield. Japanese tanks were present, but hardly the biggest danger. Snipers, machine gun nests, and fortified positions inside buildings dictated the fight. Ordinary rifles couldn't punch through thick brick or reinforced concrete, but the boy's rifle could. British and Indian defenders began using it not to stop tanks, but to break open the city itself. One corporal in the Cambridgeshires became legendary among his unit. Faced with snipers firing from a 3-story building, he used his boy's rifle like a demolition tool, firing straight through the walls and floors until the structure literally gave way. What had started life as an anti-tank weapon ended the battle as a makeshift bunker buster. Its enormous projectiles were devastating. A single hit could punch a hole the size of a clenched fist through obstacles that normally demanded mortar rounds or even artillery. Walls, barricades, fuel drums, crates, all were ripped apart by the brute force of the boy's rifle. In situations where heavier support simply wasn't available, that kind of power became priceless. Even stranger roles emerged out of pure necessity. By mid-1942 in Libya, Axis aircraft ruled the skies. Commonwealth troops endured constant strafing and bombing, and firing ordinary rifles at passing aircraft was little more than a gesture of frustration. But the boy's rifle was different. If you could lead your target properly, and if the pilot made the mistake of flying low, the huge .55 caliber round could actually do damage. It hit hard enough to tear through aluminum skin, fuel lines, or engine housings at distances that shocked the men using it. These moments were rare, but memorable. At El Alamein, in October 1942, an Australian gunner reportedly struck a Stuka during a low dive, the round shredding hydraulic lines and forcing the pilot to crash land behind his own lines. Tales like that spread quickly through the desert, half morale-boosting myth, half improbable truth. Crete produced even wilder stories. When German paratroopers descended over the island in May 1941, New Zealand and Australian defenders quickly realized they had a weapon capable of reaching up and hitting the slow-falling silhouettes drifting toward them. A boy's round striking a parachute harness, or the man strapped into it, was instantly lethal. And once the airfields fell into chaos, defenders turned the rifles on German transport planes trying to land reinforcements. Several Ju-52s were destroyed or crippled this way, fuel tanks punctured, engines wrecked, wings chewed open by half-inch steel-cord ammunition. All of this fed into the intangible yet crucial psychological effect of the weapon. Even when the boy's rifle could no longer threaten modern tanks, The soldier carrying it still held the heaviest, most intimidating personal firearm in the platoon. During the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, boys' teams kept firing at anything they could. Trucks, strongpoints, gun pits, long after the defensive line had collapsed. It was less about turning the tide, and more about refusing to give up while a single round remained in the magazine. Some field uses bordered on unbelievable. In Burma, troops reportedly used boys' rifles to blast apart log jams blocking river crossings. Others fired them as improvised signal guns, the gigantic muzzle flash visible for kilometers. In one incident that became campfire legend, a unit supposedly used a boy's rifle to kill a massive water buffalo obstructing a vital road. Nothing else available could drop an animal of that size quickly enough, and Japanese forces were closing in. The boys did the job in a single brutal shot, but for all these unconventional successes, the War Office understood the truth. The boy's rifle was finished as an anti-tank weapon. By 1942, enemy armor had outgrown it completely, while its weight and precious ammunition continued to burden already strained infantry units. Something new had to take its place. Something lighter, deadlier, and capable of killing tanks built for a very different war. That replacement was already on the drawing boards. The projector, infantry, anti-tank, the Piat. Nicknamed the Payat, though its unfortunate acronym quickly became part of barracks humor, the weapon represented a completely different approach to killing tanks. Instead of relying on raw velocity like the boy's rifle, the Piat used a hollow charge warhead. This technology didn't need speed to do its job. In theory, a properly shaped explosive could punch through almost any armor thickness by focusing its blast into a narrow jet of superheated metal. On paper, the Piat could bore through roughly 100 millimeters of steel, enough to threaten every German tank then in active service. In practice, things were far less elegant. The Piat entered production in August 1942 and filtered into frontline units early the following year. Soldiers quickly learned that while the concept was modern, the day-to-day experience of using one could be miserable. It weighed around 32 pounds, technically lighter than the boys, but its awkward, boxy profile made it a chore to carry. The real challenge, however, was cocking it. To arm the massive internal spring, an operator had to stand the weapon upright, plant the butt on the ground, and haul upward with their entire body weight. Doing this on a firing line with tanks rumbling closer was a recipe for disaster. Then there was the range, or the lack of it. The Piat was essentially a close-quarters tank killer. Under ideal conditions, you might hope for a hit at 100 yards, but most engagements happened at half that distance, sometimes even closer. The bomb-like projectile lobbed through the air with a slow, looping trajectory, making moving targets extremely tricky. A gust of wind could send a shot wide. Hitting anything beyond 50 yards required a combination of nerve, timing, and outright luck. The firing signature didn't help either. Every shot produced a heavy, echoing thump, accompanied by a flash that instantly gave away the shooter's position. And the weapon's internal spring, the very heart of the design, sometimes refused to cooperate. Misfires, failures to recock, and worn springs were common complaints. Nothing damaged a soldier's confidence like preparing to fire at an advancing tank, only for the Piat to cough, sputter, and do absolutely nothing. It's no surprise that many veterans actually preferred their outdated boys' rifles. Outclassed though it was, the boys had virtues. It shot straight, reached further, and behaved consistently. You pulled the trigger. A round went exactly where you aimed. Compared to the Piat's mechanical unpredictability, the bruising recoil of the boys seemed almost comforting. Because of this, the changeover happened slowly. Throughout 1943 and deep into 1944, many infantry battalions fielded a mix of both weapons. Some units clung to their boys' rifles until their dwindling stocks of .55 ammunition finally ran out. Others adopted the Piat only grudgingly, keeping the boys for soft-skinned vehicles, bunkers, and general fire support, while saving the Piat for close-range ambushes. In Italy, entire divisions of the 8th Army continued to operate mixed anti-tank sections well into the new year. held back by limited supply and lingering distrust. British forces encountered better options, but in nowhere near the numbers needed. The American bazooka, introduced to British troops after the U.S. entered the North African campaign in late 1942, impressed soldiers instantly. Lightweight, simple, and offering far greater standoff range. It was everything the Piat wasn't. Unfortunately, Lend-Lease deliveries couldn't meet global British demand. Meanwhile, the excellent 6-pounder anti-tank gun offered dependable long-range performance, but it required a crew, a towing vehicle, and careful placement. It was a battlefield asset, not something a two-man infantry team could carry up a hillside at midnight. The Piat was Britain's best attempt at a stopgap solution, but like the boys' rifle before it, it was ultimately a compromise. And the war was moving faster than compromises could keep up. The hard truth was simple. There was never a true, soldier-sized answer to the tank. Technology and tactics simply hadn't caught up with the pace of tank development. By the time 1943 rolled around, armored vehicles had grown too big, too thick-skinned, and too lethal for a man with a shoulder-fired tube to reliably stop. The boys had done its job when tanks were light and thin. Then the world moved on. Officially, the boys stayed on the books until 1944, but by then it was a relic. Units moving into Normandy in June were armed with Piats and 6-pounder guns. The boys were mostly pushed off the front lines and into training units, the Home Guard, or colonial postings where lighter Japanese vehicles still made them useful. Canada kept some through 1944, and a few cropped up in the Pacific and Burma into 1945, where their ability to rip through light armor and fortifications still mattered. After the war, the purge was brutal and practical. Tens of thousands of boys' rifles were melted down for steel to help rebuild a battered Britain. Most of the rest went into storage. Only a few thousand ever remained in reserve, and on rare occasions they turned up in unexpected places, even, reportedly, in limited use during the early Korean fighting, when men used anything that fired against desperate odds. But Captain Boy's legacy didn't end with the scrap heap. The central idea, give a single soldier a huge, hard-hitting round to reach targets beyond the reach of a service rifle, stayed alive. Tank armor simply outpaced what rifle ammunition could do in the 1940s, but the basic concept proved adaptable. Jump forward a few decades and you see the same thinking reborn in the anti-materiel rifle. Huge caliber, long-range rifles designed not to pierce a main battle tank's glacis, but to destroy radars, communications gear, parked aircraft, light vehicles, and hardened positions. Weapons like the .50 caliber systems of the late 20th century owe a conceptual debt to the boys. A man-portable platform firing massively energetic projectiles against targets regular infantry rifles can't touch. The British Army, too, carried that lesson forward, producing its own post-war successors that took the same principle and applied it to the needs of modern battlefields. In that way, the elephant gun survived, not as the tank killer its designers once hoped it would be, but as the grandfather of a whole class of powerful, specialized rifles. The Accuracy International AS-50, introduced in the 1980s and still fielded today, fires the same .50 BMG cartridge used by the American Barrett. At 27 pounds and nearly 6 feet long, it would look strangely familiar to any soldier who once struggled with the boys. The recoil is still brutal, a bipod is mandatory, and it's normally operated by a two-man team. What's changed is everything around the core idea. Better alloys, tighter machining, superior accuracy, and world-class optics. But the philosophy that Captain Boys introduced hasn't changed at all. The Boys rifle also left designers with a set of hard-earned lessons about what infantry anti-tank weapons must be. First, they need to be expendable. The Boys was built too well, too expensive, too slow to produce. For the scale of modern mechanized warfare, later designs had to be simple, cheap, and, if necessary, disposable. Second, ease of use mattered more than raw penetration. The Piat's theoretical armor-defeating potential meant nothing if a soldier couldn't reliably land the shot. Modern systems like the NLOW and Javelin embrace point-and-shoot simplicity over complicated mechanics. And third, the weapon must fit the reality of the battlefield. The boys functioned when tanks were thin-skinned, and operations moved at a pace that allowed careful ambushes. Later wars demanded something lighter, faster, and safe to discard once fired. German tank crews mocked the elephant gun, and in some ways their jokes came true. The boys became obsolete astonishingly fast. Few major weapons of the war saw their relevance disappear so quickly. Armor technology sprinted ahead, partly in response to weapons like the boys itself. But the mockery missed the bigger picture. The concept survived, evolved, and thrives today. Every modern sniper or special forces operator using a Barrett or an AS-50 is, in a sense, continuing the lineage that began with Captain Boy's .55 caliber Brute. And those elephant gun jokes stopped the instant a boy's round tore through the side plate of a Panzer and killed its crew. War has a way of turning derision into silence. For a narrow, critical window between 1939 and 1942, the boy's rifle gave British infantry something no one else had: a fighting chance against enemy armor. That the window closed so quickly shows how insanely fast technology evolved during the Second World War. That the boys existed at all, and worked as well as it did, when it did, is a testament to engineers trying to solve near-impossible problems with almost no time and even fewer resources.